The Whitmore ballroom glittered like a kingdom made of ice and starlight, 300 candles casting their glow across mirrors painted with frost patterns that caught and multiplied the light until the entire space seemed to shimmer with winter magic. And Georgiana Fairfax stood alone by a marble column watching the massive ornate clock on the far wall tick its way toward midnight, its brass mechanisms visible through glass, each gear turning with inexorable precision as couples positioned themselves across the polished floor for the traditional midnight waltz, their laughter rising above the orchestra that played softly in the corner, waiting for the signal to begin the dance that would welcome 1849 into London society. Her rose-pink gown had seemed so beautiful when she had dressed that evening, her maid exclaiming over how the silk complemented her complexion, how the seed pearls sewn into the bodice caught the light like dewdrops. But now Georgiana felt conspicuous in her brightness, alone while every other lady in the room stood beside a gentleman, their faces turned toward each other in anticipation of the kiss that tradition demanded when the clock struck 12. The champagne glass in her hand trembled slightly, the golden liquid inside catching the candlelight, and she forced herself to grip it more firmly, to appear composed even as her heart hammered against her ribs with a force that surely everyone could see. Sebastian Wentworth, Duke of Ashford, stood across the ballroom near the windows where evergreen garlands draped from ceiling to floor, silver ribbons woven through the branches catching the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead, and he was looking directly at her with those ice-blue eyes that had haunted her dreams since childhood, since the day her father had told her that she would one day marry the son of his dearest friend, that their futures were bound by contract and honor, and the debts that soldiers owe to those who save their lives in battle. She had been 7 years old then, and Sebastian had been 14, too old to pay attention to a child, but she had watched him from behind her governess's skirts and thought him the most handsome boy she had ever seen, dark-haired and serious even then, with eyes the color of winter sky. Now those eyes held hers across the crowded ballroom as the clock's minute hand climbed toward the 12, and standing beside him was Lady Emmeline Dashwood, a widow of 28, whose beauty was the kind that painters tried to capture, all dark curls and white skin and red lips that curved in a smile that Georgiana could see even from this distance. The whispers had started the moment Lady Emmeline had arrived on Sebastian's arm, whispers that hissed through the ballroom like wind through winter trees, because everyone knew that Lady Georgiana Fairfax was betrothed to the Duke of Ashford, that the wedding was set for 6 weeks hence in February, that the marriage contract signed at Teat, her christening bound them as surely as any vow spoken before God. Georgiana lifted her chin and met Sebastian's gaze, refusing to look away even as her chest tightened with something that felt like drowning, and she saw him turn slightly toward Lady Emmeline, saw him bend his head, and then the clock began to chime. 1, 2, 3. The sound echoed through the ballroom, and the orchestra swelled into the opening bars of the midnight waltz, and couples came together across the floor in a rustle of silk and wool, and Sebastian cupped Lady Emmeline's face in his hands. 4, 5, 6. Georgiana counted each chime because if she focused on the numbers, she would not scream, would not run, would not shatter into pieces on this polished floor where 300 of London's finest had gathered to witness her humiliation. 7, 8, 9. Sebastian's mouth met Emmeline's, and still his eyes held Georgiana's across the distance, held her pinned like a butterfly on a collector's board. And she could not look away, even though every instinct screamed at her to flee. 10, 11, 12. The kiss continued for 2 full seconds after the final chime, and then Sebastian released Lady Emmeline and began walking across the ballroom floor with deliberate steps, his evening clothes perfect, his cravat tied with precision, his face expressionless as carved marble. And Georgiana's hands shook so badly that champagne sloshed over the rim of her glass, onto her gloved fingers. The crowd parted for him as the Red Sea had parted for Moses, ladies drawing back their skirts, gentlemen stepping aside, and the whispers rose to a roar that filled Georgiana's ears like the ocean. "Did you see?" they said. He looked at her the entire time. They said, "Poor Lady Georgiana," they said, "imagine being forced to marry a man after such humiliation," they said, and she stood frozen as Sebastian approached, as he stopped before her and looked down with those winter eyes that revealed nothing of what lay beneath. "The contract stands," he said, his voice flat and cold as January wind. "We marry as planned. This changes nothing." The words hit her like stones, and she fought to keep her voice steady as she asked, "Then why, Your Grace, why do this publicly?" And even to her own ears she sounded like a child, bewildered and hurt, unable to comprehend the cruelty of adults. Sebastian's expression did not change, not a flicker of emotion crossing his features as he replied, "Because I needed you to understand the terms of our arrangement from the beginning, and then, like a knife sliding between her ribs, I will be a husband in name and duty only. And finally, my heart belongs elsewhere." Georgiana felt something inside her chest crack like ice over a frozen pond, felt the fracture spread through her entire body. But 22 years of training in deportment and dignity held her upright, kept her face composed even as her world tilted and reformed into something unrecognizable. She had known of course she had known, that their marriage was one of obligation rather than affection, that Sebastian had never courted her or written her poetry or brought her flowers the way suitors did in novels. But she had hoped, oh how foolishly she had hoped, that perhaps in time they might find some measure of regard for one another, some foundation upon which to build a life. Now he stood before her and announced his heart belonged elsewhere, belonged to the beautiful widow who even now watched from across the ballroom with a smile that spoke of victory. And Georgiana understood with perfect clarity that her future would be a desert of loneliness dressed in silk and jewels. The music continued, couples whirling past in the waltz, their faces blurred by motion and by the tears Georgiana refused to let fall, and she realized that she and Sebastian stood utterly still in the center of all that movement, an island of misery in a sea of celebration. She wanted to ask him why he hated her, what she had done to deserve this public degradation, but pride kept the questions locked behind her teeth because she would not beg, would not plead for scraps of kindness from a man who had just kissed another woman while staring into her eyes as if to brand the image on her soul. Instead, she said, in a voice that trembled only slightly, "I understand perfectly, Your Grace." And then, because she could not bear to stand there another moment beneath his arctic gaze, "I find I am unwell. Please excuse me." She turned and walked toward the doors that led to the terrace, each step measured and careful, her spine straight as a sword blade, and she felt the eyes of 300 guests boring into her back, felt their pity like hands clutching at her skirts, trying to drag her down. The cold air outside struck her face like a benediction, and she gulped it in, leaning against the stone balustrade and staring out at the frost-covered gardens that stretched away into darkness. And only then did she allow a single tear to trace down her cheek. Behind her the ballroom blazed with light and music, Sebastian no doubt standing with Lady Emmeline again, accepting congratulations from friends, pretending that he had not just destroyed another human being for reasons Georgiana could not begin to fathom. "The contract stands," he had said, and she knew it was true because her father's signature bound her as surely as chains, because the marriage settlement had been drawn up before she could walk, because honor and duty demanded she go through with this wedding, even though it would be a mockery, a business arrangement dressed in orange blossoms and lace. 6 weeks, she thought. 6 weeks until she became the Duchess of Ashford, until she tied her life to a man who had announced before all of London society that his heart belonged to another, and the future stretched before her like an endless winter night with no promise of spring. Ashford House loomed against the grey January sky like something from a Gothic novel, all dark stone and narrow windows and chimneys that rose like accusing fingers toward the clouds, and Georgiana stood in the entrance hall with her trunks piled around her and wondered if she had descended into some circle of hell that Dante had neglected to mention. The Dowager Duchess of Ashford, Sebastian's grandmother, had appeared at the Fairfax townhouse 3 weeks after the disastrous ball with a pronouncement that brooked no argument. The betrothed couple would live under the same roof until the wedding, so that Georgiana could learn the ways of the household and her future duties as Duchess. And besides, the Dowager had added with a sharp look that reminded Georgiana of a hawk eyeing prey, "My grandson needs watching to ensure he commits no further stupidity before the ceremony." Georgiana's mother had fluttered and protested, but the Dowager had simply raised one imperious eyebrow, and within hours Georgiana found herself installed in chambers on the second floor of the massive Jacobean mansion, rooms decorated in pale blues and silvers that were undoubtedly beautiful and equally undoubtedly felt like a very elegant prison cell. The bed was draped in silk, the escritoire inlaid with mother-of-pearl, the windows hung with damask that probably cost more than most families earned in a year. But what drew Georgiana's attention with horrible fascination was the door set into the wall opposite her bed, a door of dark carved oak with a brass handle that would not turn when she tried it, locked from the other side, and she knew without being told that beyond that door lay Sebastian's chambers. The Dowager had patted her hand that first evening and said, "My grandson is a fool, child, but he is not cruel by nature. Something broke in him. I suspect you might be the one to mend it if you are brave enough." And then she had swept out, leaving Georgiana alone to contemplate a future in which she would sleep every night with only a locked door between herself and a man who had publicly humiliated her while declaring his heart belonged to another woman. The first week passed in a haze of terror and careful avoidance, Georgiana learning the labyrinthine corridors of Ashford House the way a prisoner might map the walls of her cell, discovering the ballroom shrouded in holland covers, the conservatory where plants grew in wild profusion, the music room with its pianoforte gathering dust, and finally, tucked into a tower on the 3rd floor, the library. It was a circular room lined floor to ceiling with books, their leather spines gleaming in the firelight that always seemed to burn there, even when no one was present, and tall windows looked out over gardens, now covered in snow, the bare branches of trees etching black patterns against the white ground. Georgiana began spending her afternoons there, partly because the library was the only room in the entire house that felt warm, the fire crackling cheerfully while the rest of Ashford House remained cold as a tomb, and partly because she never encountered Sebastian there, he apparently having no use for books or scholarship or anything that might provide comfort. She read novels to escape her thoughts, poetry to remind herself that beauty still existed somewhere in the world, and treatises on estate management because she supposed she ought to learn something useful about the duties that would fall to her as Duchess. It was on her 5th day in the library that she noticed the desk, a massive piece of furniture made of walnut with brass fittings, positioned near one of the windows where the light would fall across it during the day, and curiosity drew her to examine it more closely, to run her fingers over the smooth wood, and wonder what correspondence a duke might conduct at such a desk. The center drawer stuck slightly when she pulled it, revealing nothing more interesting than blank paper and sticks of sealing wax. But when she pushed it closed again, she heard a click, and suddenly a hidden compartment sprang open in the side of the desk, a space no larger than a book, lined in green velvet and containing a bundle of letters tied with ribbon and a small portrait in a gilt frame. Georgiana knew she should close the compartment, should walk away and forget she had discovered this secret place. But her hands moved of their own accord, lifting out the portrait first, and she found herself staring at the image of a young Sebastian, perhaps 23 or 24, his arm around a girl of extraordinary beauty, dark curls tumbling over her shoulders, eyes bright with laughter, her face tilted up toward his with such obvious adoration that Georgiana felt her chest constrict. The inscription on the back read, "Sebastian and Eliza, forever, 1843, and Georgiana's hands began to shake as she set down the portrait and reached for the letters, untying the ribbon with fingers that fumbled at the knot. The handwriting was bold and passionate. Sebastian's hand, she assumed, though she had never seen his writing, and the words leapt off the page with an intensity that made her blush. "My darling E, I count the hours until I can hold you again. Every moment apart is torment. I dream of the day when we need no longer hide our love from the world, but can claim each other before God and society." The letters went on in this vein, dozens of them, spanning what appeared to be 2 years, and Georgiana read them with a growing ache in her chest because here was proof that Sebastian Wentworth was capable of deep feeling, of poetry and passion and devotion, just not for her, never for her. The most recent letter in the bundle was different, the handwriting feminine and elegant, and it began, "My Lord Duke," followed by threats couched in polite language. "Unless you honor your promises to me, I shall be forced to reveal the truth about Eliza's death, and your role in it. The scandal will destroy both our families, but I find I no longer care, B. Has made me reckless, and you owe me recompense for what you took from me." It was signed simply E, but this E was clearly not the same E from Sebastian's passionate declarations, and Georgiana felt as though she held pieces of a puzzle that refused to form a coherent picture. She was so absorbed in trying to understand what she had discovered that she did not hear footsteps on the tower stairs, did not notice the door opening, did not realize she was no longer alone until Sebastian's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Those are private." She gasped and spun around, the letters scattering from her lap onto the floor, the portrait clutched in her hands. And Sebastian stood in the doorway, still wearing his riding clothes, his dark hair disheveled from the wind, his face a mask of something that might have been anger or might have been pain. She could not tell. "I am sorry," she stammered. "I did not mean to pry. The compartment opened by accident, and I should not have read them. I know I should not." But Sebastian was already moving across the room with long strides, and she braced herself for his fury, for accusations and demands that she leave his house immediately. Instead, he stopped before the drinks cabinet built into the bookshelves, pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses, poured generous measures into both, and held one out to her. His hand was perfectly steady, but Georgiana saw something flicker in his eyes, some crack in the ice, and she took the glass with trembling fingers, her heart hammering so hard she felt dizzy. Sebastian drained half his whiskey in one swallow, then looked at the portrait she still held, and said in a voice rough as gravel, "She was beautiful, was she not?" It was not a question, but Georgiana answered anyway, her voice gentle. "You must have loved her very much." Sebastian laughed, but there was no humor in the sound, only bitterness that seemed to fill the entire circular room, echoing off the books and the windows and the portraits of stern Wentworth ancestors that hung between the shelves. "Love is a weapon, Lady Georgiana," he said. "It destroys everything it touches." The firelight cast shadows across his face, making him look older than his 29 years, and Georgiana found herself asking, "Then why kiss Lady Emmeline, if love is so dangerous?" Sebastian finished his whiskey and poured another, his movements controlled but his jaw tight, and when he finally spoke, his words came slowly as though dragged from some deep place he usually kept locked. "Because some debts can never be repaid," he said. "Eliza died because of me. Emmeline's hatred is deserved." Georgiana set down her own glass, the whiskey untouched because she needed all her faculties for this conversation, and she heard herself say with a conviction that surprised her, "Illness is not your fault. Your grace. Surely you know that." Sebastian turned to look at her fully, for what felt like the first time since she had arrived at Ashford House. Really, look at her, and she saw surprise cross his features. "You would defend me?" he asked, "after what I did to you?" Georgiana met his gaze and said quietly, "I am trying to understand you. There is a difference." Something shifted in the air between them, some subtle change in the quality of the silence, and Sebastian moved to one of the leather chairs by the fire, gesturing for her to take the other. Snow fell softly outside the windows, the flakes catching the firelight as they drifted past, and Georgiana settled into the chair with the portrait still in her hands, waiting. Sebastian stared into the flames and began to speak, his voice low and halting at first, then gaining strength as the words came faster. "Eliza was Emmeline's younger sister," he said, 4 years her junior, and she was everything light and joy and beauty, and I loved her from the moment I first saw her at a country assembly when I was 23 and she was 18. We courted in secret because her parents had already arranged a match for her with an elderly earl who could pay off their debts, and I was promised to you by contract though you were just a child, and we thought ourselves so clever, meeting in hidden corners of gardens, exchanging letters through bribed servants, planning an elopement that would free us both from our obligations." He paused to drink more whiskey, and Georgiana saw his hands shake slightly as he lowered the glass. "6 years ago," he continued, "we arranged to meet at midnight in the folly on her father's estate. We were going to run away that very night to Gretna Green. But when I arrived, Eliza was distraught, crying, saying she could not do it, could not bear to bring scandal on her family. And I—" He stopped, drew a breath that sounded painful. "I told her she was right, that we should wait, find another way, and she looked at me as though I had betrayed her, said I did not love her enough to risk everything. And then she ran out into a rainstorm that had blown up suddenly, ran without her cloak or bonnet, and by the time I caught up with her she had collapsed in the mud, soaked through and shivering." Sebastian's voice had gone flat, emotionless, as though he were reciting facts about someone else's life. "I carried her back to the house," he said, "but the damage was done. Within 2 days the fever took hold, and within a week she was dead. And with her last breath she cursed me for my cowardice, told me I had killed her as surely as if I had put a knife in her heart." Georgiana felt tears prick her eyes, not for herself, but for this broken man before her, carrying guilt for something that was tragedy, not crime. And she asked softly, "And Lady Emmeline?" Sebastian's laugh was bitter again. "Emmeline had encouraged the elopement," he said, "had helped arrange our meetings, had promised to cover for Eliza's absences, and when her sister died she needed someone to blame, I suppose, needed to believe it was my fault rather than simple misfortune. And so she has held it over me ever since, threatening to reveal the elopement scheme, which would indeed ruin both our families, the Dashwoods for allowing such behavior, and the Wentworths for attempting to break a marriage contract. The midnight kiss was her price for continued silence, a public humiliation to match my private guilt." Georgiana set the portrait carefully on the small table between their chairs and leaned forward, her eyes searching Sebastian's face. "That is why you were so cruel," she said, "not a question, but a realization. You were trying to protect your family's honor even at the cost of my feelings." Sebastian met her gaze, and for the first time she saw real emotion in those ice-blue eyes, regret and shame, and something that might have been hope. "I thought if I made the terms clear from the beginning," he said quietly, "if I ensured you understood I could offer nothing but a name and fortune, you might find a way to build some measure of contentment in the spaces I could not fill." But then he looked away, his jaw working. "I see now that I only inflicted needless pain, and for that, I am sorry." The apology hung in the air between them, fragile as the snowflakes still falling outside, and Georgiana felt something loosen in her chest, some tight knot of anger and hurt beginning to unravel, because here at last was honesty, here was the truth beneath the cruelty, and while it did not erase what he had done, it gave her something she had not expected to find: understanding. They sat in silence for a long moment, the fire crackling, the snow falling, and finally Georgiana said, "Tell me about her. About Eliza, what she loved, what made her laugh." And Sebastian looked at her with such surprise that she added, "If I am to live in the shadow of her memory, I should like to know who she was." So Sebastian talked, haltingly at first, and then with more ease, describing a girl who loved wildflowers and poetry, who could make anyone laugh with her impressions of stuffy dowagers, who dreamed of traveling to Italy and learning to paint, and Georgiana listened and asked questions. And slowly, so slowly, she began to see Sebastian transform from the cold duke who had kissed another woman while staring into her eyes into a man capable of grief and love and terrible guilt. A man who perhaps, given time and patience and understanding, might learn to live again instead of merely existing in penance for a tragedy that was never truly his fault. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The greenhouse stood at the far end of the formal gardens, like a palace made entirely of glass and light, its panels catching the weak February sun and transforming it into something magical. And Georgiana discovered it quite by accident on her 10th morning at Ashford House, when she followed a gravel path that wound through bare rose bushes and skeletal trees to find this unexpected Eden where summer lived perpetually, despite the frost outside. She stood at the entrance for a long moment, her breath forming clouds in the cold air, and through the glass she could see Sebastian moving among rows of orchids, his coat discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, his dark hair falling across his forehead as he bent to examine a particular bloom, and he looked so different from the rigid duke she had come to know that she almost did not recognize him. The warmth hit her like a wall when she pushed open the door, humid air thick with the scent of earth and growing things, and exotic flowers bloomed in riotous profusion, purples and pinks and whites and yellows arranged in careful rows that created a living gallery of color. Sebastian looked up at the sound of the door and froze, trowel in one hand, surprise clear on his face, and Georgiana felt like an intruder in this private sanctuary, felt she should apologize and retreat, but instead she heard herself say, "I did not know you were a gardener." He set down the trowel carefully and straightened, brushing soil from his hands, and after a pause that stretched too long, he replied, "I built this place 6 years ago." And then, as though the words were dragged from him, for Eliza she loved flowers. Georgiana nodded, understanding flooding through her, and she said quietly, "May I stay, or would you prefer solitude?" And Sebastian looked at her with an expression she could not quite read before gesturing to the rows of orchids and saying, "You are welcome here." So began a pattern that shaped the 4 weeks before the wedding, Georgiana rising early each morning to join Sebastian in the greenhouse, at first sitting silently on a bench near the door while he worked, content to watch his hands gentle among the delicate blooms, and gradually, as days passed, venturing closer to ask questions about the plants, their care, their origins. He answered her questions with a patience she had not expected, explaining that orchids were difficult to cultivate, temperamental and particular, requiring exact conditions of light and water and temperature. But when they bloomed, the effort was worthwhile. She began to talk as well, tentatively at first, about the book she was reading or some absurd rule of society that made no sense when examined logically, and to her surprise, Sebastian sometimes smiled, small quirks of his mouth that transformed his face entirely, made him look younger and less burdened. One morning she asked about the estate accounts, and he spent an hour explaining the complexities of managing tenant farms and investments, treating her questions with seriousness rather than the condescension she had expected. And she realized with a start that she enjoyed these conversations, enjoyed the way his mind worked, logical and thorough, enjoyed the rare moments when he forgot to maintain his careful distance and simply talked to her as he might to a friend. The greenhouse became a world separate from Ashford House, with its cold corridors and stern portraits, a warm pocket of life in the midst of winter. And Georgiana found herself counting the hours until morning when she could escape to this glass sanctuary, where Sebastian was not the Duke who had humiliated her, but simply a man who loved growing things and who, perhaps, was learning not to flinch when she came near. 3 weeks before the wedding, she arrived to find him standing motionless before a particular orchid. Pale pink petals with purple centers, the bloom perfectly formed and heartbreakingly lovely, and she knew before he spoke what he would say. "Her favorite," Sebastian said quietly, his voice rough with emotion, and Georgiana stayed silent, letting him have this moment of grief. Then he did something that shocked her into stillness. He reached out and cut the bloom with careful precision, cradled it in his palm as though it were made of spun glass, and turned to where she stood, watching. He crossed to her with slow steps, his eyes on her face, searching for something, and when he reached her, he lifted the orchid and pinned it carefully to her cloak, his fingers brushing her collarbone through the fabric, the touch brief but burning. "Eliza saw beauty in everything," he said, his hands still near her throat, adjusting the bloom so it sat perfectly against the dark green wool. "I think she would have seen it in you immediately." Georgiana felt her breath catch, felt heat rise in her cheeks, and she touched the orchid with reverent fingers, understanding the significance of this gift, this offering of something precious. "You honor me with the comparison," she said softly, "though I doubt I deserve it." Sebastian's hands dropped away, but he did not step back, and she could see flecks of gold in his ice-blue eyes this close, could see the way his jaw tightened as he said, "You are stronger than she was. Strength is its own kind of beauty." It was the first compliment he had paid her, the first time he had looked at her and seen something worthy of admiration. And Georgiana felt something flutter in her chest, something fragile and new that she was afraid to examine too closely. They stood there for a long moment, surrounded by orchids and humid warmth and the sound of water dripping from the irrigation system. And then Sebastian cleared his throat and stepped back. And the spell broke, but the orchid remained pinned to her cloak, a tangible proof that something was shifting between them. That afternoon, Georgiana sat in her chambers trying to read but unable to focus, her fingers straying constantly to touch the orchid that she had placed in water beside her bed. And she was so absorbed in her thoughts that she did not hear the commotion downstairs until her maid burst in announcing that Lady Emmeline Dashwood had arrived and was demanding to see the Duke. Georgiana's first instinct was to remain hidden, to let Sebastian handle his former love's sister without witness. But then she thought of his face in the greenhouse that morning, the way he had looked at her when he pinned the orchid to her cloak, and she found herself moving toward the stairs with her heart pounding. She reached the formal drawing room to find Sebastian standing rigid before the fireplace, while Lady Emmeline paced the floor, her beautiful face twisted with anger, and neither of them noticed Georgiana in the doorway, as Emmeline said in a voice sharp as broken glass, "You cannot simply dismiss me after all I have sacrificed, after all you owe to Eliza's memory." Sebastian's voice was low and controlled, but Georgiana could hear the strain beneath. "I did what you asked. I kissed you at the ball. I humiliated my betrothed publicly. The debt is paid." Emmeline whirled to face him, her silk skirts rustling, and her laugh was bitter. "That was merely the beginning," she said. "Here are my true terms. You will install me as your mistress after the marriage, provide me a household on the estate, a generous allowance, access to society as your companion. It is what Eliza would have wanted, for me to be cared for." Georgiana felt the words like blows, felt her newfound hope crumble to ash. But then she looked at Sebastian's face, and saw not acceptance but anguish, saw him trapped between guilt and growing resistance, and before she could think better of it, she stepped into the room and said clearly, "That is not what any loving sister would want. You dishonor her memory with these demands." Both Sebastian and Emmeline turned to stare at her, Emmeline's expression shifting from shock to fury, while Sebastian's showed something like wonder, and Georgiana felt her hands begin to shake, but kept her voice steady as she continued. "You did not love Eliza, Lady Emmeline, or you would not use her death as currency to purchase your own comfort." Emmeline's beautiful face contorted with rage, and she hissed, "How dare you speak of things you cannot understand? You know nothing of love or loss. You are merely a girl married off for her family's convenience." Georgiana lifted her chin and met Emmeline's gaze without flinching, even though her heart hammered so hard she felt dizzy. "I know that love does not demand endless payment for tragedy," she said. "I know that a sister who truly cared for Eliza's happiness would want the man she loved to find peace, not remain chained to guilt forever. And I know that your demands have nothing to do with honoring the dead and everything to do with your own greed." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the ornate clock on the mantel. And then Sebastian spoke, his voice clear and firm in a way Georgiana had never heard before. "No," he said, and the single word seemed to fill the entire room. Emmeline turned to him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What did you say?" she demanded. Sebastian moved away from the fireplace, came to stand beside Georgiana, not touching her but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I said no," he repeated. "The debt is paid, Lady Emmeline. I gave you the public humiliation you demanded. I have carried guilt for 6 years over a tragedy that was no one's fault. But I will not give you this. I will not dishonor my marriage before it has even begun. I will not install you as my mistress, and I will not allow you to continue using Eliza's memory as a weapon. You will leave Ashford House immediately, and you will not return." Emmeline's face went white, then red, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, and she spat. "You will regret this. I will tell everyone about the elopement. I will ruin you and your precious bride both." Sebastian's expression did not change, but his voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. "If you do," he said quietly, "I will make it known that you encouraged and facilitated your sister's secret meetings, that you helped plan an elopement that would have brought scandal on your family, and I will reveal that Eliza's illness began the night she met me, because you told her our appointment was at the Folly, when in fact I had written to say we should meet at the house. Safe from the weather, you changed the location, and she went to the wrong place, and waited in the rain for an hour before I found her." Emmeline's face drained of all color, and she took a step back. "That is a lie," she whispered, but her voice shook, and Georgiana knew with sudden certainty that it was not a lie at all, that this was the truth Sebastian had carried alone, that Emmeline's guilt was even greater than his own. "Leave," Sebastian said, his voice implacable, "and never approach me or my wife again. If you do, I will destroy you without hesitation." Emmeline looked between them, her beautiful face ugly now with rage and fear, and then she turned and fled, her footsteps echoing in the marble hall, and moments later they heard the sound of her carriage departing at speed. Georgiana realized she was trembling, her breath coming too fast, and Sebastian turned to her with an expression of such raw emotion that she could not look away. "You defended me," he said, his voice wondering. "Why?" Georgiana met his eyes and said, "Because what she asked was wrong," and then, hesitating, "Because you are not the villain you believe yourself to be." Sebastian reached out slowly, giving her time to retreat, and when she did not move, he took her hand in both of his touch warm and solid. "I have been cruel to you," he said quietly. "I have hurt you and humiliated you and treated you as though you were merely an obligation, but you have shown me nothing but compassion and understanding, and today you stood beside me when you had every right to let Emmeline's demands destroy what little peace I have found. I do not deserve your kindness, Georgiana, but I find I am grateful for it beyond measure." Georgiana felt tears prick her eyes, because this was Sebastian without armor, without the ice that usually encased him, and she tightened her fingers around his and said, "We neither of us chose this marriage, but perhaps we can choose what we make of it." Sebastian lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, the gesture courtly but his eyes intense, and he said, "I would like that very much." They stood there in the formal drawing room with its cold elegance and watching portraits, but Georgiana thought of the greenhouse with its warmth and life and growing things, thought of the orchid he had pinned to her cloak that morning, and she understood that they had crossed some invisible threshold, that the man before her was no longer merely the Duke who had kissed another woman while staring into her eyes, but someone who might, given time and patience, become something more. The Ashford family chapel stood on a hill overlooking the estate, a small stone building with stained glass windows that caught the setting sun and transformed it into rivers of color, gold and ruby and sapphire streaming across the ancient floor, and Georgiana walked down the short aisle with her hand on her brother's arm, feeling as though she moved through a dream. There were only 20 guests gathered in the wooden pews, family and close friends rather than the hundreds who would have attended a grand society wedding, and she was grateful for the intimacy, grateful that this ceremony would be witnessed by people who wished them well rather than by gossips eager to dissect every expression and gesture. Her gown was ivory silk that whispered against the stone floor, and she had gasped when the dressmaker first showed it to her because the bodice and sleeves were covered in delicate embroidery of orchids, pale pink and purple blooms so lifelike she half expected them to release their scent, and her maid had told her that the Duke himself had requested the design, had spent an hour with the seamstress describing exactly what he wanted. Now, as she approached the altar where Sebastian waited, she touched one of the embroidered flowers and felt her heart swell, because this was proof that he had been thinking of her, planning this detail, wanting her to wear something beautiful on their wedding day. Sebastian stood straight and solemn in his dark coat and ivory waistcoat, his cravat tied with precision. But when he turned to watch her approach, something shifted in his expression, some softening around his eyes that made him look younger, less burdened, and Georgiana felt tears prick her eyes because she had not expected tenderness from him, had steeled herself for cold formality. The ceremony passed in a blur of words spoken by the elderly vicar who had christened Sebastian and his father before him, the familiar phrases of the marriage service taking on new weight when applied to her own life, and then came the vows, the moment when everything would become irrevocable. The vicar turned to Sebastian and asked, "Wilt thou have this woman to thy wedded wife, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony? Wilt thou love her, comfort her, honor and keep her in sickness and in health, and forsaking all other keep thee only unto her, so long as ye both shall live?" Georgiana held her breath, waiting for Sebastian to recite the words as mere formality, but instead he looked directly into her eyes, held her gaze with an intensity that made the rest of the chapel fade away, and said, "I will," with such conviction that she felt the words in her chest like a physical touch. His ice-blue eyes were warm in the colored light from the windows, and she saw something there that might have been promise, or might have been plea. And when her own turn came to speak, the vows, her voice shook only slightly, as she pledged herself to this man who had hurt her, and then shown her unexpected depths of feeling. The vicar pronounced them man and wife. Sebastian slid a gold band onto her finger, and then they were walking back down the aisle together, his hand warm over hers where it rested on his arm, and Georgiana thought that perhaps this marriage might become something more than the cold arrangement she had feared. The wedding breakfast was held in the conservatory, The greenhouse expanded with temporary walls of glass to accommodate tables laden with delicacies, and orchids bloomed everywhere, transforming the space into something magical. Georgiana understood that Sebastian had chosen this location deliberately, had wanted to marry her in the space where they had learned to talk to each other, where he had given her the first orchid and told her she was strong, and she felt overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of it, by this evidence that he cared about her happiness. The Dowager Duchess rose to give a toast when the meal concluded, her sharp eyes moving from Sebastian to Georgiana and back again, and she lifted her glass and said in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, "To my grandson, who has finally stopped running from happiness, and to his bride, who has the courage to catch him." The guests laughed and applauded, and Sebastian reached under the table to take Georgiana's hand, his fingers threading through hers in a gesture that felt both intimate and natural. And she squeezed back, feeling hope unfurl in her chest like the orchids that surrounded them. The afternoon faded into evening, guests departed with congratulations and embraces, and eventually Georgiana found herself alone in her chambers with her maid helping her out of the wedding gown and into a nightdress of white silk and lace, her hair brushed loose over her shoulders. And then the maid was gone, and she stood by the window watching snow begin to fall softly over the darkened gardens. She did not know what to expect from this night, whether Sebastian would maintain the distance he had promised at the ball when he said he would be a husband in name and duty only, or whether the warmth she had seen in his eyes during the vows meant something had changed between them. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she moved to sit on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from trembling, and she stared at the locked door that connected her chamber to Sebastian's, that barrier that had stood between them since she arrived at Ashford House. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Time seemed to have lost all meaning, and then she heard movement from Sebastian's room, footsteps crossing the floor, and her breath caught in her throat. The sound of the lock clicking open was loud in the silence, a metallic snap that seemed to echo through both rooms, and then the door swung inward, and Sebastian stood in the doorway still wearing his wedding clothes, though he had removed his coat and loosened his cravat, and in his hand he held a single orchid, pale pink with purple centers, Eliza's favorite, and Georgiana understood the significance of the gesture, understood that he was offering her this piece of his past as a way of moving forward into their future. "May I come in, Georgiana?" he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "Not because duty demands it, but because I want to, because I find I cannot bear the thought of spending another night alone when you are so close." Georgiana felt her heart swell until she thought it might burst from her chest, and she extended her hand toward him, her voice steady, despite the tears that gathered in her eyes as she replied, "I have been waiting for you, Sebastian, not out of obligation, but out of hope." He crossed the threshold with slow steps, his eyes never leaving her face, and he closed the door behind him with a soft click, shutting out the rest of the world, creating a space that belonged only to them. He set the orchid on the bedside table, and then he was kneeling before her, his hands coming up to frame her face with such gentleness that she caught her breath, and he leaned in and kissed her. It was nothing like the cruel kiss he had given Emmeline while staring into Georgiana's eyes across a crowded ballroom. Nothing like that calculated performance meant to wound and establish distance. Instead, this kiss was tender and careful, as though she were something precious that might break if handled roughly, and she felt herself melting into it, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders as he deepened the kiss with a quiet sound that might have been relief or surrender. "I am sorry," he whispered against her lips, his forehead resting against hers, "for the ball, for the coldness, for making you doubt your worth even for a moment. You are extraordinary, Georgiana, and I was a fool not to see it immediately." She kissed him again in answer because words felt inadequate, and then his hands were in her hair and hers were pushing his waistcoat from his shoulders, and they moved, together toward the bed with a hunger that surprised them both. He was gentle with her, patient through her nervousness, his hands and mouth learning her body with reverent attention, whispering endearments against her skin that made her blush and arch into his touch. And when he finally made her his wife, in truth, the brief pain was swallowed by pleasure and by the profound intimacy of being joined with another person, of looking into Sebastian's eyes and seeing not ice but warmth, not distance but presence. And she understood that this was what marriage could be when built on growing affection rather than cold obligation. Afterward they lay tangled together in the sheets, the firelight casting shadows across their skin, and Sebastian traced patterns on her shoulder with one finger, his expression distant in a way that made Georgiana's chest tighten with concern. She turned in his arms to face him fully, and asked softly, "What are you thinking?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer, but then he drew a shuddering breath and said, "I have never told anyone the complete truth about the night Eliza died. Emmeline knows some of it and has used what she knows to manipulate me, but there are things I have kept locked away because the shame was too great to voice." Georgiana took his hand and pressed it to her heart, letting him feel the steady beat beneath his palm, and she said, "Tell me, Sebastian. Let me help you carry it." So he told her, his voice breaking at times, how Eliza had begged him to run away that night because her family was forcing her to marry an elderly earl who would pay their debts, how the rainstorm meeting was supposed to be their elopement, how he had arrived at the folly to find her wild with desperation. He told her how he had hesitated, had thought about the scandal and the ruin that would befall both families if they eloped, had suggested they wait and find a legitimate path forward, and Eliza had looked at him with devastation in her eyes and screamed that he did not love her enough to risk everything. She ran into the storm, Sebastian said, his voice barely a whisper. And I chased her, but she was so fast, and the rain was so heavy I could barely see. And when I finally found her, she had collapsed in the mud near the river, soaked through and shivering, and I carried her home, but the damage was done. The fever took hold within days, and she died cursing me, telling me I had killed her with my cowardice, that if I had truly loved her, I would have chosen her over propriety. Georgiana felt tears slide down her cheeks, and she held Sebastian tighter as his body shook with silent sobs, this proud man finally letting himself grieve for the girl he had loved and lost. "What you could not have known," Sebastian continued when he could speak again, "is that Emmeline had orchestrated the entire elopement plot. She encouraged Eliza to pursue me, even though we were both promised elsewhere. She helped us arrange secret meetings, and I learned later that she had hoped the scandal of an elopement would rid her of the sister who overshadowed her in beauty and charm. Eliza was always their father's favorite, and Emmeline resented it. When Eliza died, Emmeline needed to deflect her own guilt, so she blamed me. And I let her because I thought I deserved the blame. Thought if I had just been braver or more decisive, Eliza would still be alive." Georgiana stroked his hair, his face, letting her touch speak comfort when words seemed insufficient, and she said gently, "Eliza died of illness, Sebastian, not of heartbreak or cowardice or any fault of yours. She made a choice to run into a storm, and tragedy followed, but that does not make you responsible for it." Sebastian lifted his head to look at her, his eyes red from tears, and he said, "I have carried that guilt for 6 years, have punished myself and you by extension, but you have shown me, Georgiana, that perhaps I deserve a second chance at happiness, if you will grant me one." Georgiana cupped his face in her hands and said fiercely, "Then let it end tonight. Let us both choose life, choose hope, choose each other, no more ghosts. Sebastian, only us." He kissed her again, deep and passionate, and she felt the last barriers between them crumble, felt him give himself to her fully, without the armor of guilt or the weight of the past. And when they made love again, it was slower, deeper, a claiming and a surrender all at once. Later, as they lay drowsing in the firelight, Sebastian's arms wrapped around her, and the orchid scent filling the room, Georgiana looked at the door standing open between their chambers, that door that had been locked for so long, and she understood that it symbolized more than just physical access. It represented Sebastian's willingness to let her into the locked rooms of his heart, to share the burden of his grief and the hope of his future. "How did I deserve you?" he murmured against her hair. "After everything I have done." Georgiana smiled and turned to press a kiss to his jaw and replied, "Perhaps we both deserved a second chance. The question is, what will we do with it?" Sebastian tightened his arms around her and said, "I will love you, Georgiana. I will spend every day of our life together showing you that you made the right choice in defending me, in believing I could be more than the broken man who hurt you." She settled against his chest, listening to his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, and outside the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white, covering the old scars with new promise, and she thought that perhaps their marriage, which had begun with such cruelty and pain, might transform into something beautiful after all, something worth the waiting and the hurt, something that would bloom like the orchids Sebastian tended with such care in their glass sanctuary. The pamphlet appeared in every fashionable drawing room in London within a single day. Its pages passed from hand to hand with the kind of gleeful horror that society reserved for truly spectacular scandals, and when Sebastian brought it to Georgiana in the greenhouse, where she sat reading among the orchids, his face was ashen, and his hands shook as he held out the cheaply printed pages. "The True Story of the Ashford Scandal," the title proclaimed in lurid letters, and beneath it a detailed account of Sebastian's relationship with Eliza that twisted every fact into something sordid, claiming he had seduced an innocent girl with promises of marriage, abandoned her when she became inconvenient, and then murdered her to silence her demands, forcing Lady Georgiana Fairfax into marriage to provide himself with respectable cover and deflect suspicion. The words were poison dressed as truth, details accurate enough to convince readers, but framed to suggest the worst possible interpretations, and Georgiana felt her chest tighten as she read, because she understood immediately that this was Emmeline's revenge, that the woman who had lost her battle for Sebastian's guilt and patronage had decided to destroy him publicly if she could not control him privately. Sebastian paced the length of the greenhouse like a caged animal, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, and he said in a voice tight with fury and despair, "I will not have you touched by this filth. Georgiana, you should return to your family. Let me face this alone. Society will eventually tire of the scandal and move on to fresh meat, but there is no reason you should suffer for my past." Georgiana set down the pamphlet with careful precision and stood, crossing to where Sebastian had stopped by the orchids, and she took his face in her hands and forced him to look at her. "I am your wife," she said firmly. "We face this together or not at all. You wanted to spare me the midnight kiss scandal, but instead you have given me something more valuable, the chance to stand beside you as an equal, and I will not squander it by running away when things become difficult." Sebastian covered her hands with his own, his eyes searching her face as though trying to memorize every detail, and he said, "Society will be vicious. They will say terrible things about you, about us both." Georgiana lifted her chin in the gesture that had become familiar to him, that expression of determination that made her look like a queen facing down an army, and she replied, "Then let them say terrible things about us both. I am your wife, and your battles are mine." The Dowager Duchess agreed with Georgiana's assessment when they gathered in the library that evening to plan their response, the old woman's sharp eyes snapping with fury as she read the pamphlet, and then tossed it into the fire where it curled and blackened. "We attend the Tilney Ball tomorrow night," the Dowager announced. "It is the first major event of the season, and all of London will be there. If we hide, they will assume the accusations have merit. But if we appear together united, we show them. This poison has no power over us." Georgiana felt her stomach clench at the thought of facing 500 guests who would all have read the pamphlet, who would all be watching for signs of guilt or shame or discord. But she nodded and said, "I will need a gown that makes a statement." The dowager smiled, sharp and fierce, and replied, "I have just the thing. It was mine when I was your age, and it has intimidated better people than these provincial gossips." The next 24 hours passed in a blur of preparation, Georgiana's maid altering the dowager's ball gown to fit her smaller frame, the dress a deep sapphire silk that made Georgiana's eyes look even more striking, cut lower than she would normally wear, but the dowager insisted, "You must look like a duchess, child, not a frightened girl," and Sebastian practicing what he would say when confronted, though Georgiana could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw remained tight, no matter how much he tried to appear relaxed. She spent hours alone in her chamber practicing her own speech, the words she had been crafting since reading the pamphlet, her voice shaking at first but growing stronger with repetition, and she thought of the midnight kiss, of standing alone by a marble column while Sebastian kissed Emmeline and stared into her eyes, and she drew strength from the knowledge that she had survived that humiliation and could survive this as well. The Tilney ballroom was decorated in reds and golds, aggressive colors that seemed designed to inflame passions rather than soothe them. And when Sebastian and Georgiana arrived in the doorway, the entire massive space fell silent, 500 faces turning toward them with expressions ranging from avid curiosity to open hostility. Georgiana gripped Sebastian's arm hard enough that she knew she would leave marks through his evening coat. But she kept her face composed, serene even, as they descended the shallow steps into the ballroom, and the crowd parted before them like the Red Sea before Moses, guests stepping back to create a corridor of judgment through which they must walk. The whispers started immediately, hissing through the space like wind through dead leaves. "Did you read the pamphlet?" They said, "Imagine forcing that poor girl to marry him." They said, "I always knew there was something wrong about the Ashford marriage," they said, and Georgiana felt each word like a stone thrown at her back, but she kept walking, kept her chin lifted and her spine straight. Sebastian's hand covered hers on his arm, warm and steady, and she felt him vibrating with tension, his protective instincts warring with his knowledge that any outburst would only feed the scandal. They reached the center of the ballroom, that vast expanse of polished floor where couples would soon dance, and Georgiana knew this was the moment, knew that if she waited any longer, her courage would fail, and so she released Sebastian's arm and walked away from him toward the orchestra dies at the far end of the room. Her legs felt like water, each step requiring conscious effort, and the space seemed to expand around her until she felt utterly exposed, 500 pairs of eyes boring into her like physical touch. But she thought of Sebastian's face when he had given her the first orchid, thought of the way he had unlocked the door between their chambers and asked permission to enter, thought of all the small acts of trust and tenderness that had built between them, and she forced herself forward. She reached the dais and turned to face the crowd, and in a voice that started uncertain but grew stronger, she asked the orchestra to pause their tuning. The conductor, looking startled, raised his baton for silence, and suddenly the entire ballroom held its breath, waiting. Georgiana looked out over the sea of faces, found Sebastian's among them, his expression a mixture of pride and terror, and she began to speak. "My husband loved Eliza Dashwood with the passion of youth," she said, and the crowd gasped because no one had expected her to acknowledge the relationship directly. Her death was a tragedy of illness, not malice, and those who would profit from grief dishonor her memory more than any living person ever could. The silence was absolute now, not even the rustle of fans or whisper of silk, and Georgiana felt power flow into her voice as she continued. "I stand before you as the Duchess of Ashford, chosen not to cover scandal but to build a future with a man I have come to love and respect. Love and loss are not scandals, they are human experiences. My husband grieves an old love while building a new one, and I honor both the woman who came before me and the marriage we create together." She saw movement in the crowd, saw Emmeline's white face near the back, and she looked directly at the woman who had tried to destroy them and said, "Those who cannot understand such complexity reveal more about their own hearts than ours. Those who spread poison about the dead do so because they have no beauty in their own lives to celebrate. I will not stand here and deny that my husband loved another woman. I will instead tell you that his capacity for deep feeling is what drew me to him, that his grief speaks to the depth of his heart, and that I am proud to be his wife." The speech ended, and for a long moment no one moved, no one breathed, and Georgiana felt her knees begin to shake, because perhaps she had miscalculated. Perhaps she had only made things worse. But then the Dowager Duchess began to applaud, slow and deliberate, her weathered hands coming together with sharp cracks that echoed through the ballroom, and one by one other guests joined her, the sound building like a wave until the entire space rang with it. Georgiana saw tears streaming down Sebastian's face as he pushed through the crowd toward her, saw Emmeline's expression cycle from shock to rage to fear as former friends turned away from her, cutting her dead with the precision that only society could manage. And then Sebastian was there, his hands framing her face, and he said in a voice choked with emotion, "You are magnificent. I love you. I am not worthy of you, but I will spend my life trying to be." The orchestra, sensing their cue, began to play, and Sebastian led Georgiana onto the floor for a waltz, and she realized with a start that it was midnight, the same hour when he had kissed Emmeline while staring into her eyes. But now he held her in his arms and looked at her with such love that she felt breathless with the beauty of it. "You are my wife," he whispered as they turned in time to the music. "My partner, my equal, my love. When I kissed Lady Emmeline while looking at you, I was trying to push you away, to prove I was incapable of love. But tonight you have shown me I was wrong. I am capable of love because I love you desperately." Georgiana smiled up at him, tears blurring her vision, but her heart so full she thought it might burst. And she replied, "Then show me, Sebastian, not with words or grand gestures, but with a lifetime." Other couples joined them on the floor, the ballroom transforming from hostile arena to celebration, and Georgiana caught glimpses of Emmeline fleeing through the crowd, her beautiful face ugly with defeat. But she felt no triumph, only relief that this chapter was finally closed. The Dowager Duchess watched from the sidelines with satisfaction, and later she would tell Georgiana that she had never been more proud of anyone in her entire life, that the speech had been perfectly calibrated to acknowledge truth while reframing it in terms society could accept, that Georgiana had taken what could have been their destruction and turned it into their victory. Sebastian held Georgiana closer as the waltz continued, his cheek pressed to her temple, and he murmured, "I do not deserve you, but I will spend every day being grateful that you chose to stand with me." She turned her head to press a kiss to his jaw and said, "We chose each other. That is what marriage means, not the contract our fathers signed, but the daily decision to remain together through scandal and joy and everything between." The music swelled, and other guests watched them with expressions no longer hostile, but approving, even moved. And Georgiana understood that they had crossed some invisible threshold, that the midnight kiss which had begun their story with such cruelty had been transformed into this midnight waltz, this public declaration of unity and love that would be remembered long after the scandal faded. The pamphlet would be forgotten within a month, dismissed as the bitter ravings of a jealous woman. But the image of the Duke and Duchess of Ashford dancing together at midnight, while the ton applauded, would become legend, whispered about in drawing rooms as an example of true partnership, and young girls would sigh over the romance of it, never knowing the pain that had preceded the beauty. When the waltz ended, Sebastian bowed over Georgiana's hand with courtly precision, then led her from the floor through guests who smiled and nodded approval, and they collected the dowager and departed into the winter night, snow beginning to fall as their carriage carried them back to Ashford House. In the privacy of the carriage, Sebastian pulled Georgiana into his arms and kissed her with desperate intensity, his hands in her hair and his body shaking. And when he finally released her, he said, "I was prepared to face them alone, to let their hatred wash over me as I have been doing for 6 years. But you stood beside me and defended me and transformed everything. How did you find such courage?" Georgiana settled against his chest, listening to his heart race beneath her ear, and she said honestly, "I found it in you, in the way you have shown me that people can change, that past mistakes do not define future happiness. You gave me the greenhouse and the orchids and the locked door opening. You gave me yourself, and that was worth fighting for." The dowager smiled from her seat opposite them and said, "You two are nauseatingly romantic, but I suppose that is preferable to the alternative. Now kindly remember I am present and keep your displays of affection to socially acceptable levels." They laughed, the tension of the evening finally breaking, and Georgiana thought that this was what family felt like, this warmth and acceptance and willingness to stand together against the world, and she was grateful beyond measure that the midnight kiss which had seemed like the end of all hope had instead been the beginning of everything she had never known to want. Spring arrived at Ashford House like a benediction, the gardens that had been frozen and barren through the winter suddenly erupting with colour, daffodils pushing through the last patches of snow and trees unfurling tender green leaves that caught the sunlight and seemed to glow from within. And Georgiana stood in the greenhouse surrounded by orchids in full bloom, purples and pinks and whites and yellows creating a living tapestry of beauty, and pressed her hand to her still flat stomach, while trying to find the courage to tell Sebastian the news she had confirmed with the physician that morning. She had been married for 3 months, 3 months of happiness so profound it sometimes frightened her, because surely nothing so perfect could last. Surely fate would find a way to snatch this joy away, as it had snatched Eliza from Sebastian all those years ago. And now she carried within her body the evidence of their love, a child who would be born in the autumn when the leaves turned gold and the air grew crisp. Sebastian arrived as he did every morning, shedding his coat and rolling up his shirt sleeves to tend the orchids that had become as essential to him as breathing, and he smiled when he saw her, that open, unguarded expression that still made her heart stutter, because she remembered too well the frozen duke who had kissed another woman while staring into her eyes, and announced his heart belonged elsewhere. "Good morning," he said, crossing to kiss her with a tenderness that never failed to make her feel cherished. And then, noticing something in her expression, "What is it? Has something happened?" Georgiana took his hand and placed it on her stomach, her own hand covering his, and she said simply, "I am with child, Sebastian. We are going to have a baby." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, suspended in the humid warmth of the greenhouse, and she watched emotions chase across his face, shock giving way to wonder, giving way to pure, incandescent joy. And then tears were streaming down his cheeks, and he was dropping to his knees before her, his hands spread across her belly, his forehead pressed to the fabric of her dress. "A child," he said, his voice breaking. "Our child." And then, "Georgiana, I never thought, after everything, I do not deserve this happiness." She stroked his hair, dark silk under her fingers, and said gently, "Perhaps none of us deserve happiness, Sebastian, but we can choose to accept it when it arrives. And this child is not a burden or an obligation, but a gift, a promise of the future we are building together." Sebastian looked up at her with his face wet with tears and something like fear in his eyes, and he said, "What if something goes wrong? What if I lose you the way I lost Eliza? I could not survive it." Georgiana knelt beside him on the greenhouse floor, the scent of earth and orchids surrounding them, and she took his face in her hands and said firmly, "You will not lose me. I am strong and healthy, and I have the best physicians in London at my disposal. But more than that, I have you. And I have every intention of being here to watch our child grow and to grow old beside you. So put those fears away, my love. We have mourned the past long enough. Now we celebrate the future." He kissed her then with desperate intensity, his hands in her hair and his body shaking. And when he finally released her, he laughed, the sound surprised and delighted, and he said, "We are going to be parents. You are going to be a mother. I am going to be a father." And suddenly the future that had seemed so uncertain when they married now stretched before them, full of possibility. That evening after dinner, Sebastian asked Georgiana to join him in the library, and she found him pacing before the fire with an expression of nervous determination that reminded her of the early days of their marriage, when every interaction had been fraught with tension and unspoken pain. He stopped when she entered and took her hands in his, and he said without preamble, "Will you marry me again?" Georgiana blinked, confused, and replied, "We are already married, Sebastian. Or have you forgotten the ceremony 3 months ago?" He smiled, that crooked half-smile that made him look boyish despite his 29 years, and explained, "Our first wedding was duty and contract, a legal formality to satisfy our father's wishes and society's expectations. But I want to marry you again, Georgiana, this time purely for love, with vows we write ourselves that speak to who we truly are and what we truly promise each other." Georgiana felt her eyes fill with tears, because this was so perfectly Sebastian, this desire to remake their beginning now that they understood what they meant to each other. And she said, "Yes, yes, I will marry you again. I will marry you as many times as you wish." They spent the next 3 days writing their vows, Georgiana sitting at her escritoire with paper and ink, crossing out phrases that sounded too formal or too flowery, struggling to find words adequate to express the depth of what she felt, finally settling on simple, powerful promises that came from her heart rather than her head. Sebastian worked in the greenhouse, surrounded by his orchids, and she would find him sometimes staring into space, with a pen in his hand, lost in thought, and she knew he was wrestling with the same challenge, trying to distill months of transformation into sentences that would capture the essence of their love. The ceremony was held on a Saturday evening at sunset, the greenhouse filled with golden light that made the glass walls glow as though the entire structure were made of captured sun, and Georgiana wore a simple dress of spring green with flowers in her hair instead of a veil, no jewels or elaborate styling, just herself as she truly was. Sebastian wore shirt sleeves and a waistcoat, no coat or cravat, and the Dowager Duchess sat on a chair near the door serving as their only witness, her sharp eyes soft with emotion. They stood facing each other with hands clasped, the orchids blooming around them in glorious profusion. And Sebastian began to speak, his voice rough with feeling. "I promise to unlock every door between us," he said, his eyes never leaving Georgiana's face. "I promise to see you, truly see you, every day of our lives. I promise to love you more than I fear being hurt. I promise to build a future worthy of you. And then," his voice breaking, "I was dead before you, Georgiana. You brought me back to life." Georgiana felt tears slide down her cheeks as she replied with her own vows. "I promise to stand beside you in ballrooms and battles. I promise to believe in you when you cannot believe in yourself. I promise to tend our love as carefully as you tend these orchids, with patience and attention and faith in what will bloom." And then, squeezing his hands, "We brought each other to life, Sebastian. That is what love does." The Dowager Duchess murmured, "About time," when they kissed, and Georgiana laughed against Sebastian's mouth, tasting salt from their mingled tears. And she thought that this ceremony, private and simple and utterly theirs, was more meaningful than the formal wedding in the chapel had been, because this was their choice, their declaration, their promise made without any shadow of duty or obligation. After the ceremony, Sebastian led Georgiana to a workbench, where he had prepared a pot of rich soil, and beside it sat a small orchid, its roots carefully wrapped, a hybrid variety he explained that he had been cultivating for months, crossing 2 different species to create something entirely new. "We will plant it together," he said, "and name it for you, for the grace you have shown me, and the future we are building." And so they knelt side by side on the greenhouse floor, their hands clasped around the pot as they settled the orchid into the soil, and Sebastian christened it Georgiana's Grace. And Georgiana thought of their child growing within her, another new creation born of their union, and she understood that they were planting more than flowers. They were planting hope and continuity, and the promise that love could bloom even after the harshest winter. The days that followed were golden, Georgiana's pregnancy progressing without complication, Sebastian becoming increasingly protective and tender, the dowager pronouncing herself thoroughly satisfied with the state of affairs and already planning the nursery. Spring deepened into early summer, the gardens exploding with roses and lavender, and one evening Georgiana found Sebastian in the greenhouse at an unusual hour, nearly midnight, standing among the orchids with a thoughtful expression. She joined him, slipping her hand into his, and he pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his hands resting on the gentle swell of her belly that was just beginning to show. "Do you forgive me?" he asked quietly, "for that night, for the kiss, for everything I did to hurt you?" Georgiana turned in his arms to face him, and she saw in his eyes that he needed to hear this, needed the absolution she had already given him 100 times in actions, if not words. "There is nothing to forgive," she said, looking up at him with all the love she felt blazing in her expression. "That night brought me to you. I would relive it 1,000 times if it meant ending here in your arms." Sebastian cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she had not realized were falling, and he said, "I kissed another woman at midnight while looking at you. It was the cruelest thing I have ever done." Georgiana smiled, that serene expression that had become her armor and her truth, and she replied, "You kissed another woman at midnight while looking at me. It was the beginning of our story. The cruelty was temporary, but the love is forever." Somewhere in the house a clock began to chime midnight, the sound carrying through the open greenhouse windows, and Sebastian bent his head to kiss her as the chimes counted out the hour, 1, 2, 3. And this kiss was nothing like that first midnight kiss, nothing like the performative cruelty he had inflicted to push her away and establish his emotional distance. Instead, this was tender and deep and full of promise, a kiss that spoke of partnership and passion and the profound intimacy they had built together through months of learning each other's hearts. 4, 5, 6, the chimes continued, and Georgiana pressed closer to Sebastian, her hands in his hair, her body fitting against his as though they had been designed specifically for each other. 7, 8, 9. And she thought of that girl in the rose-pink gown standing alone by a marble column while her betrothed humiliated her publicly, thought of how far they had both traveled from that moment of devastation. 10, 11, 12. The final chime rang out, and Sebastian lifted his head, his forehead resting against hers, their breath mingling in the warm greenhouse air. "I love you," he said, his voice fierce with conviction. "I will never stop saying it, because I spent too long silent, too long locked behind walls of guilt and grief, but you demolished those walls with your compassion and your courage and your refusal to accept anything less than my whole heart." Georgiana kissed him again, soft and sweet, and said, "Then say it forever, Sebastian. I will never tire of hearing it, and know that I love you just as fiercely, just as completely. You are my husband and my partner and the father of my child, and I choose you every day, not because a contract demands it, but because my heart demands it." They stood together in the greenhouse, surrounded by blooming orchids, the Georgiana's grace they had planted together already showing signs of new growth, and through the glass walls they could see the moon rising over Ashford House, silver light bathing the gardens and the ancient stone walls, and Georgiana thought that this was happiness, this quiet moment with the man she loved, this certainty that they had built something real and lasting from the wreckage of that midnight kiss. Sebastian had been trying to push her away that night at the Whitmore ball, had been trying to prove he was incapable of love, had been using cruelty as a shield against the possibility of future pain, but his plan had failed spectacularly because Georgiana had seen through the cruelty to the broken man beneath, had chosen to understand rather than condemn, had offered him grace when he deserved judgment, and in doing so had given him permission to heal, to grow, to love again. The orchid Eliza had loved, pale pink with purple centers, bloomed nearby, and Georgiana reached out to touch it gently, honoring the memory of the girl who had loved Sebastian first, the girl whose death had nearly destroyed him, but whose memory had also, paradoxically, prepared him to appreciate the strength and compassion Georgiana offered, because grief had taught him the value of love, had taught him not to take happiness for granted, had taught him to cherish what he had while he had it. "We should go inside," Sebastian said reluctantly. "You need your rest. The physician said you should not overtire yourself." Georgiana laughed and stood on her toes to kiss his jaw and replied, "I am pregnant, Sebastian, not made of spun glass. But yes, let us go to bed." And they walked hand in hand from the greenhouse to the house, through corridors no longer cold but warm with the evidence of their shared life, portraits and flowers and books they had read together. And when they reached their chambers, the door between their rooms stood open as it had since their wedding night, that symbolic barrier permanently removed. Later, as they lay tangled together in bed, moonlight streaming through the windows and Sebastian's hand resting possessively on the curve of her belly, Georgiana thought about the midnight kiss that had begun everything, thought about how what had seemed like an ending had actually been a beginning, and she understood that sometimes the cruelest moments in life were actually gifts in disguise, opportunities for transformation that would never have come through easier paths. Sebastian had kissed another woman while staring into her eyes, had announced his heart belonged elsewhere, had seemed determined to make their marriage a cold formality. But beneath that cruelty had been a wounded man, terrified of risking his heart again, and Georgiana had seen that fear, and chosen to dismantle it piece by piece with patience and understanding, until Sebastian had no defenses left, until he stood before her, completely vulnerable and completely hers. The child within her stirred, a flutter like butterfly wings, and Georgiana pressed Sebastian's hand more firmly to her stomach so he could feel it too, and his sharp intake of breath told her he had. "Our child," he whispered with wonder, "our future." She turned to look at him in the moonlight, his features softened by shadow and by love, and she said, "Our child, our future, our choice." And that is the difference, Sebastian. We choose this. We choose each other. We choose love over fear and hope over grief, and that choice transforms everything. He kissed her temple, her cheek, her lips, murmuring endearments and promises between each kiss, and Georgiana closed her eyes and let herself drift into sleep, surrounded by warmth and safety, and the bone-deep certainty that she was loved, that she was cherished, that the midnight kiss which had seemed to destroy her future had instead given her everything she had never known to want, a partner who saw her truly, a love that had been tested and proven, and a happiness that would bloom like orchids in the greenhouse, beautiful and resilient and entirely theirs.